Hello everyone, and welcome back for our next lecture presentation. This lecture presentation will cover Chapter 28, which will involve the reproductive systems. Now at this point, in our experiences here in anatomy and physiology, we have now gone over all of the other body systems that we will cover. The reproductive systems will be the last of our 11 body systems, but as we come to a close on these topics, I will mention that this system is a double whammy. We're specifically going to see a different reproductive system in the male than we see in the female. So we're going to need to learn both of these systems, and we're also going to see how these systems come together to facilitate the function of this system, which of course is reproduction. There will be some overlap with some of the components of the reproductive system with other body systems as well. But keep in mind that in both the male and female reproductive systems, the major goal is to produce gametes that will meet and form a new person. You'll find your objectives for this chapter listed on this slide and the next. We're going to get started in this chapter by first going over the anatomy and physiology of the male reproductive system, and then we're going to transition into learning the female reproductive system. We're going to discuss the endocrine and exocrine products of each of these systems, and we're also going to talk about how the gametes of each of these systems come together through the act of sexual reproduction. We're going to explain the process of gametogenesis, which is called something separate in the male versus the female. In the male, gametogenesis is called spermatogenesis, as this is the formation of the gametes, which in the male are the sperm cells, and in females this process is known as oogenesis. These indicate the process of meiosis, which is a specialized form of cell division that only takes place in the reproductive organs. Finishing up the male reproductive physiology, we're going to discuss the autonomic control of erection and ejaculation, and we're also going to mention the hormonal control of spermatogenesis as well. We're going to see that hormones will play an extremely important role here in the reproductive systems. And not only is spermatogenesis regulated by hormones, but oogenesis will be highly regulated by hormones as well. Once we've made it through the male reproductive system, we're going to cover female reproductive anatomy, and then go into the physiological processes that system entails. We'll touch on the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, which includes lots of hormonal regulation and many different stages as well. So barring any further introduction, let's begin breaking down the components of the reproductive system. So as I have already mentioned, and as the name of this body system suggests, the purpose of the reproductive system is to reproduce. These systems, in males and in females, work together to make new humans, which, frankly, is quite a profound responsibility, if you ask me. In order to carry out this ever noble role, each system is going to produce their own gametes, which are also known as the sex cells. Sperm cells in males and egg cells in females. And egg cells are also known as oocytes. The primary sex organs will be the location of gamete production, which refers to the process of gametogenesis. The testes are the primary sex organs in males, and the ovaries are the primary sex organ in females. These are also known as the gonads, and the gonads will not only be responsible for producing gametes, but they're also responsible for producing and releasing the sex hormones. The gonads do belong to more than one body system. Specifically, we did see the gonads as members of the endocrine system, and now we are seeing them as part of the reproductive systems. Testosterone will be released from cells in the testes, and this hormone will be useful in the development of male secondary sex characteristics and the stimulation of gametogenesis in the male as well. Estrogen and progesterone are the female sex hormones, and those will play exactly the same role in the female body as we see testosterone playing in the male body. So we've got primary sex organs that are going to be producing the gametes. The gametes are going to be the sex cells that come together to form a new person. Sperm cells in males and oocytes in females. Gametogenesis refers to their production, and in males, gametogenesis is called spermatogenesis, and in females, gametogenesis is known as oogenesis. The gonads in males are going to release testosterone, and the gonads in females are going to release estrogen and progesterone. This is going to be a very big component of our presentation on the reproductive system. But before we start breaking down hormonal control and hormonal regulation of different events that take place in this system, we first must begin with covering the reproductive anatomy. We will first begin with the male. So what we can see here is a sagittal section of the male reproductive system, and there's quite a bit of structures that we can find labeled on this slide. I'm going to start with the gonads in each of these systems, as that's where the sex cells are going to come from, and we'll move ourselves down the pathway that these gametes take as they leave the gonads. So first and foremost, the gonads in males are the testes. The testes will be found right here within this sac of skin known as the scrotum. I'm not exactly sure where the origin comes from, but scrotum means bag. So this is the bag of skin that contains the testes. We also want to keep in mind that there are two testicles, one on the right side and one on the left side. And each testicle will serve the same function for the male reproductive system. On the back side of the testes, we're going to see this structure known as the epididymis. And while we will see a section of the epididymis very, very shortly, I just want to mention that the function of the epididymis is to store sperm cells that are produced inside of the testes. There's an intricate tubular system inside of the testes that will be responsible for producing sperm cells. Sperm cells that are produced in the testes will be stored in the epididymis. And when they're ready to be released, sperm cells in the epididymis will then move up here into what's known as the vas deferens. You can see this is labeled as ductus deferens, but on the test it will be labeled as the vas deferens, so make sure to note that. Sperm cells will move up the vas deferens and eventually loop over the urinary bladder, which we can see here, and we also discussed this in our last chapter. The vas deferens will course around the backside of the urinary bladder and eventually enlarge, which is an area that we refer to as the ampulla of the vas deferens. The ampulla of the vas deferens is an important landmark because when the vas deferens enlarges, that's going to come together with what's known as the seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicle is one of our accessory organs that will be releasing seminal fluid into this tube. The ampulla of the vas deferens as well as the seminal vesicle will come together, and that will form the ejaculatory duct that will eventually dump into the urethra. As mentioned in chapter 26, the urethra is shared between the urinary system and the reproductive system in the male specifically. The urethra is much, much longer in the male, and we see it starting here at the urinary bladder and coursing all the way down out through the penis. There are three parts to the urethra, the first of which is known as the prostatic urethra. This is the part of the urethra that's in the prostate gland, which can be found right here, and will also receive secretions from the ejaculatory ducts. The prostatic urethra will course down and eventually form the intermediate or membranous urethra, which can be found right here. And as the urethra continues, it's going to enter into the penis, and we then will call it the penile urethra or the spongy urethra. I'll explain a little later as to why we call this the spongy urethra, but I do prefer to call this the penile urethra as it's found housed within the penis. We'll hopefully remember that the urinary bladder is infraperitoneal, so we see the peritoneum sitting right on top of it. We'll also see the pubic symphysis, which can be shown right here, and the bulbourethral glands, which can be found over here. The seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral glands are the three accessory structures that will secrete the products that make up the fluid that's going to bathe the sperm cells. Together with the sperm cells, the secretions of these three glands make up semen. And semen will enter the prostatic urethra and eventually make its way out of the penis. The penis can be separated into a root, as well as a body, and also a head. The body of the penis is often referred to as the shaft of the penis, and the head of the penis also gets its own name known as the glans penis. The glans penis will contain the corona of the glans as well as the prepuce, often known as the foreskin. The shaft of the penis specifically is made up of three different columns known as corpora cavernosum and the corpus spongiosum. The corpora cavernosum are paired structures that can be found on either side of the penis. These are going to be the areas that will fill up with blood in the event of an erection. And the corpus spongiosum will be found inferiorly on the penis, containing the spongy urethra. This is where the spongy penile urethra gets its name. One thing that you're likely going to see about the male reproductive anatomy is that it's much, much more intricate than the female reproductive anatomy. But this will balance out when we get to the reproductive physiology. Generally, what I tend to find is that male reproductive physiology is a little bit easier than female reproductive physiology. So it's an even trade-off that male reproductive anatomy is a little bit more challenging and female reproductive physiology is a little bit more challenging. All of that is my own personal opinion, but again, what I think that you will find is that the female reproductive anatomy will be much more straightforward. So on this slide, we can see an anterior view and a transverse section of the penis. We can also see the scrotum shown down here and its contents shown as well. Once again, we'll see here the testes are going to be found inside of the scrotum. The skin of the scrotum will loop down around the testes and form this structure between them known as the raphe. As mentioned before, both testicles will be found inside of the scrotum, and the scrotum will also have its own scrotal septum to keep the testes apart from one another. The reason that there is a septum in the scrotum in the first place is to make sure that if there's any type of stimuli compromising one of the testicles, that the other testicle will not be in contact with the one that's been compromised. This can ensure that one testicle can at least remain and produce some sperm cells. The testicles themselves are going to have several different layers. We're going to have the tunica vaginalis, which is found out here on the outermost layer of the testes, and we'll also find the tunica albuginea, which can be found here deep to the tunica vaginalis. The tunica vaginalis actually acts as a bit of a serous membrane to the testes. This is an extension of the peritoneum. So you might be wondering how the peritoneum got all the way down here. Well, when the testes are developing, they're actually developing retroperitoneal, and as they descend, they're going to drag the peritoneum down into the scrotum with them. So that's what this tunica vaginalis is going to be showing. We find the epididymis shown here on the backside of the testes, and then from the epididymis, we're going to find the vas deferens, which will take sperm cells up out of the scrotum. The vas deferens is just one of the structures that can be found in what is known as the spermatic cord. The spermatic cord can be shown here, and it contains many different vessels that will course down and supply the testes. The spermatic cord will pass through this structure known as the inguinal canal, and it contains various structures, the first of which is the vas deferens, as I just mentioned. But we're also going to find inside of the spermatic cord the testicular artery, as well as the testicular pampiniform plexus of veins, lymphatic vessels, autonomic nerves, and also the cremaster muscle. All of these are structures contained within the spermatic cord. So you can see that there are many different vessels that need to make their way to the testes. The testicular artery is going to be in here to supply the testes with blood, and the pampiniform plexus of veins are going to be present to drain the testes of blood. We're going to have autonomic nerves and lymphatic vessels as well, and even the cremaster muscle, which is actually shown much better right here. The cremaster muscle is actually an extension of the internal oblique muscle. You can see that shown here, and this cremaster coursing down to the testes. The cremaster muscle works in conjunction with the dartos muscle, and the dartos muscle can be found here wrapping around the testes themselves, sort of on the inside of the scrotum. The dartos muscle and the cremaster muscle will regulate the distance that the testes will sit from the rest of the body. The reason for this is that sperm production is most efficient about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius cooler than normal body temperature. This is why the testes hang. And so in the event that the temperature of the testes is below 2 to 3 degrees under our body temperature, the cremaster muscle and the dartos muscle are going to constrict to pull the testes up closer to the rest of the body. This allows the testes to absorb more heat from the body so that they're at that optimal temperature to produce sperm cells. So you can really see in this picture how involved the scrotum is and how many important structures can be found in this. Now up here, we also have the penis, which is transversely sectioned. What I want you to focus in on here is the 2 corpora cavernosum on either side. These will fill with blood to lead to an erection, and the corpus spongiosum, which can be found here, which will contain the spongy penile urethra. The penis will have its own blood supply, as you can see right here, and we'll further discuss this blood supply in later slides. On this slide, you can see a sagittal section of the testicle, and this is going to give us a better idea of the structures that are found in here. The first thing that I want to mention is the spermatic cord, which can be seen here. The spermatic cord is containing the pampiniform plexus of veins. We'll find the vas deferens as well as the testicular artery, as well as lymphatic vessels and autonomic vessels too. But the spermatic cord is going to be continuous with what is known as the tunica vaginalis. And I mentioned that the tunica vaginalis is actually going to have its parietal layer as well as a visceral layer. Following the tunica vaginalis down, you can see the parietal layer shown right here, and it's eventually going to loop back on itself to give us the visceral layer, which can be found in here, contacting the tunica albuginea. The tunica albuginea will form these little septum in here to give rise to the different lobules inside of the testes. You can see a lobule shown right here, and each lobule will contain what are known as seminiferous tubules. Seminiferous tubules are going to be one of the most important anatomical parts of the testes that I'm going to talk about. These are the structures that will produce the sperm cells that will ultimately be used for reproduction. The seminiferous tubules will contain specialized stem cells, known as spermatogonia, that are going to give rise to new sperm cells. The seminiferous tubules are actually tubes, and they're going to all connect through this structure here, known as the reedy testes. The reedy testis is going to lead into the efferent ducts, which will eventually enter into the epididymis. The epididymis is separated into the head, the body, as well as the tail. And it's also a very, very coiled network of tubes, which once again I'll mention is where sperm cells are going to be stored. Sperm cells stored in the epididymis will eventually be released through ejaculation into the vas deferens, and they'll travel up the spermatic cord and eventually into the ejaculatory ducts. Something I definitely want you to focus on is the pathway that sperm takes as it leaves the male reproductive system. So in comparison to what we just saw on the last slide, you can see a sagittal section of the testes shown right here, and you can just see a specimen right here. You'll see the testicles shown here, and the epididymis that can be found behind it. The spermatic cord and all of its vessels will course down to the testicles to supply them, and this will also be continuous with the parietal layer of the tunica vaginalis. Looking here at the sagittal section, you can also see the tunica albuginea that's giving rise to the septum that will form the lobules inside of the testes, the seminiferous tubules that will sit in each of those lobules, and the reedy testes that can be found right in here. These seminiferous tubules are going to be where sperm cells are produced. They're going to flow into the reedy testes through the efferent ducts up into the epididymis. The epididymis will flow into the vas deferens, and then the sperm cells will continue their journey out of the male reproductive system.